Hey guys, cheers. Coffee time number 2. Well, that's my second batch of coffee that I've made here at home, and only the second time I've made coffee at home. And since I got the desire to make coffee, I figured, I had talked about it so much, about how I've never had coffee at home, or rarely, at least in my home. And now I bought a coffee machine a couple weeks ago. And my first pot, I made a video, and this is my second pot, so I decided, you know what, I'm going to make another video. Plus it helps me avoid doing any kind of work. I'm a bit off the cuff today, without very much preparation at all. I hope you don't mind. Today is not going to be a lesson, so you can put away your notepads. I've made a lot of videos lately, and I've made a lot of videos that were too long. Hopefully this one is going to be way, way, way shorter, because I am not doing a ton of stuff. Very little preparation today, actually. I did, when I did my last video on Harold Weiss, I mentioned how I had written these notes and I couldn't find them in time to reference them for my video. They're sitting right in front of me now. I mentioned that, of course, I would find them after the video was recorded, and here they are, now that I don't need them. What brings me to today's video is all over the place, in terms of artists and stuff. So I'm doing a few things here, and I guess the thing that started today's video was really when I was taking a trip in my car, which now I'm not working, so I don't travel as much as I used to. So it's usually just for errands and doing my laundry and things like that. I was doing my laundry the other day, and been playing a compilation that our friend Jeff sent me made from his vinyl collection of jazz things. Quite a few things stood out on that compilation, but one of the things that I was able to pick up on, because I didn't know who was playing until I can get home and take a look at the list of the musicians and what tracks. It's just a compilation, so tons and tons of different artists on these couple discs he sent me, which have between 90 and 99 tracks on them. All various artists, various time periods, all jazz-oriented stuff. I heard this one and I said, I think that's Chico Hamilton, because Chico Hamilton was very famous in the 1950s for being one of the first guys to bring a cello into a small jazz quartet. So he had a quartet or quintet with electric guitar, drums, bass, and cello. I'm not sure if he had piano in there or not, or maybe he did off and on. Or horn player too. Yes, he had horn players. Some very famous horn players, including Buddy Collette. I'm not going into a big Chico Hamilton thing here, but I will make mention that anyway, I was listening to this compilation, and these tracks really stood out. You could tell they kind of sounded like they were from the late 50s, early 60s, which they were, from the late 50s actually. Electric guitar and bass and cello, and when you heard the cello, very, very, very cool stuff. I highly recommend it. Chico Hamilton actually recorded a whole bunch of albums in that time period using a cello in a quintet section. Any fans of jazz, especially the slight chamberish feeling that it gives, and because it's a different sound for what you're used to hearing, with typical jazz smaller ensembles with piano and bass and drums and horns, having the electric guitar and the cello in there, which he kept for quite a while, even though the musicians changed. Really something special. If you're a jazz fan, you really owe it to yourself to get something by Chico Hamilton from well, I want to say all periods are pretty much worthwhile listening to. But really, to hear that particular ensemble with the cello and the electric guitar in it, and there's a whole bunch of things in print, just really fantastic. So when I got home, I took a look and I found out the album that Jeff had sampled that track from, just to see if it was in print, if it was obtainable. And what I found is just in the last, I want to say month, I think in October these came out, October 2015, there's several very, very reasonably priced box sets taking Chico Hamilton's recordings from specific years, from like the mid-50s to the late 50s, late 50s, or maybe like 59 to the early 60s, and putting them in very inexpensive box sets. And sometimes these box sets are something to be very wary of, because there are budget companies out there that are making easily obtainable, very, very inexpensive box sets that contain 4, 5, or 6 albums by an artist, basically for a little more than the price of a single CD. But sonically, they're absolutely awful, and they don't come with any liner notes. You don't know who plays on them. They usually just do these little cardboard replicas of the album covers, which are so small you can't read. And I've understood there's been a lot of these are things all done pretty much overseas, but that do come over here to the States. And there's some pretty awful quality recordings on them, as if they had taken these things off of even at times some. Well, I know there's cases where there's mono recordings from things that were released in stereo, some things that sound like they're coming off of old vinyl when these things have been released digitally and remastered. So sometimes those budget things are only good to introduce you to an artist, and then if you like the stuff, maybe buy better versions of it, but as a way of obtaining a lot of very inexpensive material from an artist instead of maybe just sampling one album. In general, honestly, I've tried to stay away from them. But what I found out in just the last month, apparently these Chico Hamilton box sets that are coming out, I believe each of the ones, I think, started mid to late 50s, I believe, is one of them, and then the other one picks up from 59 into the early 60s. These supposedly are the, if not completely remastered, they are up to the standard of the individual CDs if you were to buy them. The nice thing with them, I believe, both of the box sets, I'm doing this from memory, I think there are only 3 CDs in each one, but it's 6 complete albums on each one at a reasonable price. Apparently they're not the El Cheapo repackagings. And because I don't have any of that stuff on CD from that time period, thanks to Jeff and his wonderful sampler that he sent me, I'm really looking to, these are in my wish list, and I'm looking to obtain them as soon as possible. And I highly recommend, if you're a jazz fan, especially if you're into the older school stuff, Chico Hamilton, that quintet with cello, and I think it was Fred Katz on cello, but I could be wrong. And there was a couple different people that through the years, I think he had a couple different. Jim Hall was one of the first electric guitarists he had, but all of the musicians revolved around and changed through the years. That he did have the cello in the quintet. The quintet started with Buddy Collette, who I had forgotten had played with Chico Hamilton, and I mentioned Buddy Collette when I did Howard Rumsey's Lighthouse Jazz All-Stars, because Buddy Collette played on a bunch of their recordings, and I loved his playing. Buddy Collette's done, I think he did a lot of studio stuff actually too. But Buddy Collette, who was a multiple, played flute and saxophone and other instruments like that. So he had a lot of different timbres that came out of his mouth, basically, because he played so many different instruments. Jim Hall played in the original quintet. Fred Katz was the cellist, I'm checking here. The bassist played. Interestingly enough, Charles Lloyd played in Chico Hamilton's band. Gabor Szabo was a guitarist that I love, also deceased. But my point of this whole thing actually was, I know Chico Hamilton has been very active And the last time I checked on him, he was still making records. I only have a couple things here to show. I have to get a lot more Chico Hamilton, and I have some vinyl, but honestly, I took a quick look flipping through things and I couldn't find it. So got a couple things here. This is later period stuff. This is from the late 90s or late 90s. This is more probably the most commercial thing I've ever heard him do. It was a band with electric bass, drums, saxophone, and guitar. Almost smooth jazz. Very much not like what you would associate with Chico Hamilton. This one I particularly love. Hopefully you can see that because I'm not looking at my camera. This is interesting and, again, different. This is what I like about Chico. He did a lot of different albums. This is basically just him on percussion alone with overdubbing. He's the only musician on here. It's called Dancing to a Different Drummer. It was out of print, but it is coming in print. It's on the Soul Note label, a very good, I believe, Italian label. It went out of print, but copies were still around. And let me turn down the volume of that a little bit. That might be too loud. I know it's a bit loud for me. Dancing to a Different Drummer, just Chico alone with overdubbing. I love it, and he does narration. Excuse me, he does narration as well. Kind of a little bit about drums, actually. It's quite interesting. Let's see, the instruments listed: drums, percussion, slapophone. Don't know what that is. Timpani, tambourine, gong, and vocals. Pretty sure there's no singing in this. I didn't listen to it recently, but I loved it. It's more of a narration thing. Very interesting. One track is called The Snare Drum. One is called Universal Language of Man. Waltz of the Mallets, Symbols of Love, Mr. Joe Jones, which is a dedication to Joe Jones, the earlier drummer. Dance of the Timpanis. So it's kind of like the history of drumming, but it's a fun album, and I don't think he ever did anything else like it. It did go out of print, and not even as part as that the reissued set. But I just found out that the Soul Note has also done a box set of the albums that Chico Hamilton recorded for them very recently, and has 5 or 6 albums in this box set that includes this album as well as a whole bunch of other things that Chico did at the time for the Soul Note label. And this would have been, and this one is from the '94, so I guess in the early '90s or so was when Chico did a bunch of recordings for Soul Note. And that box set is another one that I put on my wish list, even though I have this one album in there, because the Soul Note stuff is probably a lot of those individual albums are out of print, and just the fact that you can obtain any of them at a decent price, forget about a bargain price, is pretty incredible guy. And I know Chico Hamilton was definitely older. He's definitely one of the elder statesmen of jazz. And what happens, and I did an earlier video on this, and I will continue to do videos on this, is I somewhat hesitatingly went on the internet to find out something that I feared. And yes, once again, I have just learned as of yesterday that Mr. Hamilton passed away on November 25th, 2013. At the age of 92, and he was recording right up to the end. Major bummer, and for me personally. And once again, I'm going to go on a rant about how the news doesn't report these things. I mean, this guy was a giant musician certainly in the 50s. Probably people that didn't even like jazz would know who Chico Hamilton was in the 50s and 60s. How could the news not report it? And he stayed in this country and everything. He's living in New York and everything. So that upset me a great deal. And for some reason, whenever I discover this and I go online or something and I find still yet another major jazz musician's passed away and no, the media did not report it or make any mention of it, it always brings me back to this guy, Charlie Mariano, my favorite saxophone player in the whole world. And I was another guy that I was listening to who passed away in 2009, and I did not find out for several years that he had passed away. And I go on this rant because Charlie Mariano was another major jazz musician who actually left the country in he's American though. I mean, he left the country in 1971 to live in Europe, settled in Germany, and lived the rest of his life there because work is better for jazz musicians in Germany. But, for some reason, the first thing that always goes to my mind is I was pretty upset when I found out Charlie Mariano had passed away. I knew he was getting up there in years, just like Chico Hamilton, and I was so hesitant to type Chico Hamilton's name into the internet thing to find out, gee, I wonder if he's still recording, I'm not sure. And of course to find out that there's a hell of a lot of great bands out in the ether, I guess now, made up of these musicians that the American media can't be bothered to report on when they pass away, which just is very upsetting to me. But it always takes me back to good old Charlie. When I found out that he had passed away, without anybody reporting on it, I was pretty upset. And like I had said in an earlier video of mine that I will continue to do, is I have a lot of musicians that I got into, primarily jazz musicians, but a lot of musicians that I got into that were alive when I was into them, when I first discovered them and bought their albums, and they passed away, after I became a fan, and in a lot of cases didn't find out for years after. It makes it hard to listen to their music after they pass for me. And like I said, also, some of these musicians that I was lucky enough to get into, in quotes, after they passed away, I don't have that with. Like Wes Montgomery was already gone before I got into his music. John Coltrane was already gone because they both went 67 or 68. So that was a whole different thing. They were already gone. I always have trouble, when these guys pass while I was a fan, kind of listening to their music again. Some people I haven't been able to go back and listen to their music now, and they've been gone 6 or 7 years. So on that theme, I came across, I just went into my vinyl pile. Once I decided to do another one of these videos on these guys who have passed, whose music it's a little bit hard for me to listen to, since I got into them, prior to their passing away, and the sad, I should say funny, but the sad truth is that flipping through the racks of my albums, there were so many people there that fit that bill that had died within recent years, that I was into when they were alive, that it's like, oh, I could do a dozen of these videos. And I probably will, spread over time. Another guy, most of these artists are not related at all. I'm just kind of doing a bit of people off the cuff here. But another one was a guy who, now this one was, another one's interesting to me because not only did the media not report on it, but he was a New Jersey guy, no less. He lived the last 30, 40 years, whatever, right here in New Jersey, and not even the Jersey News reported when he passed away in 1998, and I did not find out. This was really a delayed action. I didn't find out, I think, until this year that he passed away. And again, somebody I was a fan of since the late 70s. And that's guitarist Tal Farlow, another mainstream bebop guitarist, incredible talent. A couple people, George Benson once commented on the incredible reach of Tal Farlow's fingers, which you might be able to get a slight idea. It's a little hard to tell maybe how wide his hand was and his grip and his fingers were. But the funny thing is that once again the New Jersey and even New York News did not report on his passing, and it was funny because the New Jersey public television station actually did a 1 hour profile on him. I want to say probably in the late 80s, early 90s, and they showed him in his house. He lived down at the Jersey Shore. He was still playing clubs around New Jersey and New York for many years. They interviewed his wife. They interviewed some other musicians he played with, And that particular, which I think was available, it was available on videotape, and I think that 1 hour documentary on him was available on DVD, and it was all done during his lifetime. And, just discussed his career. That was played for years and years and years and years on this New Jersey public television station. And to the best of my knowledge, I don't really watch their news on there, but I probably think I would have known if they had reported his passing. And like I said, I don't think I found out until this year. So he died in '98, so I'm about 17 years behind the ball there. But another guy. Now I haven't listened to his stuff since I found out about his passing. And again, I only pulled the albums that I had immediately available that were here. This is a nice 2-disc Verve compilation album that consisted of, it's 2 albums. One album is a previously released album, and the second disc was all previously unreleased stuff. It's called Poppin' and Burnin', and I do not know if this probably hasn't come out in this form, in this format on CD. They may have reissued the 2 discs separately. Good stuff. This stuff is from the 50s, 55 and 56, and 58. But I remember that's for some reason one of those records. I remember the record store where I bought that when it came out as a new release. They came out as a new release. One of the albums, as I said, was a reissue of something that had come out in the 50s. But this came out in the mid 80s, in '84. I bought it as a new release, and I had the whole second disc of previously unreleased stuff, which is as good as the release stuff. Another one that if you're into mainstream jazz at all, you got to check out some Red Norvo Trio stuff. This is incredible. This is a particularly good album, and I brought it here to show because of the Tal Farlow Association. But at the time when I bought this, this is another 2-disc set from 1976. I bought this a couple years after it came out. I wasn't into jazz in '76, but by '78 I was. So I probably bought it around then. The incredible thing with this is when I bought this, the music is the incredible thing. And if you like vibraphone at all, and you like mainstream jazz at all, I highly recommend it. Most of this stuff is amongst the older jazz things that I personally own. All the tracks on here look like they were recorded in 1950 and 51, so that's old stuff. So there's no incredibly long tracks. They were mostly shorter tracks then, because I think they were these things probably came out on 78 records back then. But the incredible thing to hear is there's no drummer in here. And when Tal Farlow wasn't playing a solo or playing chords, and somebody else was taking a solo like Red Norvo on the Vibes, Tal Farlow developed this technique of tapping the dampened strings on his electric guitar. In a way, I would have liked to have seen this because I haven't heard anybody else do this, that it sounds like a bongo drum. And if you just listen to it, you would say, oh, all of a sudden there's bongo drums on here. And it was a technique, and it really drove the rhythm section because there was no drums in the band. And it was just Charles Mingus on bass, another guy who was alive when I got into him who passed away, Red Norvo, another guy I was into who passed away, and Tal Farlow. When I bought this, all 3 of those guys were alive, and they've all since passed away. Now, Red Norvo was another guy that stayed active for a very, very, very long time, really pretty much up to the end. And he passed away in '99, and Tal Farlow passed away in '98. I always thought Red Norvo was older, but maybe that's just because he was bald. But this is really, if you like mainstream jazz at all, there's no extended jamming on here, and I think that's mainly because of the LP format at the time. But wow, incredible stuff. And when Tal Farlow does that bongo drum thing on the guitar, which he didn't do after this because his ensembles pretty much almost most of the time included drums. But it was a great little thing, a trio of bass, electric guitar, and vibes. I highly recommend anything you could get that was done by these three guys. And another one, I didn't hear about Tal Farlow when he passed away. I didn't hear about Red Norvo when he passed away. I recall knowing something about Charles Mingus. Maybe that's only because he was so ill for the last few years of his life that it was apparent that he wasn't going to be around much longer. So I remember in there around 78 or 70, somewhere in there, Joni Mitchell had done some work with Charles Mingus. It was very much toward the end of his life. I got to recommend this again. This is such fantastic stuff. I have a bunch more, and this is already going longer than I wanted it to. Another guy that I got into while he was alive, probably like a lot of you, Stan Getz. And this is an orchestral album called Focus. I think this one took a while to come out on CD. This was an import. This looks like a Japanese import. That was out of print at the time that I bought it, probably in the early 80s. A fairly famous album by him, because I think this is an orchestral album. I thought I would show that. Forest Eyes, another particular favorite of mine, of Stan Getz. Another guy, he was alive, at the time I got into him. So it's been a little difficult for me to listen to him. I actually have a whole bunch of CDs that I forgot to pull of later stuff. Guitarist Chuck Loeb actually played with him. Some fusion musicians actually played with Stan Getz. I have a 69 or 70, a double disc set of an unusual setting for him. I believe it's only a trio of organ, drums, and Stan Getz on sax, no bass player. And that's a very interesting double disc CD set. I think it was something that didn't come out on LP. I could be wrong. It was one of those recordings that was not issued at the time. It was a club date. I actually don't know where my Stan Getz CDs are, so even if I wanted to show them, I wouldn't be able to. But that's a particularly interesting lineup for him, because Stan Getz usually played with a little larger band, quartets, quintets. But the organ, drums, and sax is particularly interested. I'm kind of more interested in the... Oh, and he did a famous album, which I have as well, with Chick Corea backing him. And that was after Chick got into the fusion phase, even. So there's electric piano on there. If I'm not mistaken, there's electric piano on there. That's another one I haven't seen for a while. I know I have it here somewhere. So Stan did... I always kind of like those things that are a little bit more away from his comfort zone, which is obviously from the period he's from ballads and those kind of standards and those kind of things. He was always open to different music environments, even though his style and his playing didn't change much. He didn't go and do a free jazz thing. But he died in 1991, a long time ago. But I was already into him, and I don't... you know what? Probably the way that I heard about Stan Getz and Charles Mingus, now that I think about it, is we do have a non-profit jazz station, WBGO, right here in New Jersey. That's 88.3 on the dial on FM, and it's the first station on FM. And it's commercial free because God knows jazz could never survive in a commercial environment, not real jazz. And I guess I probably found out about Stan Getz and Charles Mingus passing from that station. If somebody passes and you don't happen to be tuned in to the station during that period where they mention it, you're not going to get it from the news. Lady Gaga and Madonna, yes, you'll hear about them when they change their nail color. Another fun. This is really a famous album. I guess this is another one was this out of print? Because here's another Japanese vinyl import. And I don't have any special desire to go after expensive Japanese vinyl imports at all. I think this was out of print in the U.S. at the time that I bought some of these albums, and I just happened to end up with I know the Japanese vinyl was much better quality, but the pressings were better. But no, the Jazz Sambas is a famous one. Stan Getz, Charlie Bird. I'm probably a bigger fan of Charlie Bird than Stan Getz even. And another guy that passed away unbeknownst to me, and I'm a major Charlie Bird fan. I was going to pull his records for this, but I'm doing Charlie Bird in with a group of his of guys like Herb Ellis and Barney Kessel, the great guitarist guys. I'm going to do them all together. Like I said, I like Stan Getz's More Unusual Things, which is probably the albums that I've shown, except for this last one, which is the bossa nova kind of thing. And I'm guessing that probably most people are familiar with Stan Getz in terms of, if not his actual albums, tons of his albums, they're probably familiar with his style of playing, I would say. In terms of, he was not somebody that was known for hard blowing and screeching. He was very soft player. You heard the breath in his playing. You could always hear the breath in his saxophone playing. So even when he would have some kind of like fusion guys like a Chuck Loeb or Chick Corea backing him up, his playing style really didn't change. He was known for being very soft, and as a result, even though I don't have probably more than a dozen of his albums or so, he's a fairly easy guy amongst saxophone players to pick out. Simply because of that soft blown style that he has. So he's another guy I recommend, but I think most of you guys know that. When I think of Stan Getz, I think of another saxophone player who I discovered totally by accident. A guy that was a protege, kind of one of his teachers, the great pianist Lenny Tristano, who died in 78, I think it was. So yeah, he died in November 78. November 1878. Pianist. Interestingly, he's known as being a very forward, harmonically thinking pianist, and almost like the founder of free jazz, but not free jazz in the screechy kind of way that you associate it with. Now, what little I know about him, and I read, he didn't like the free jazz screechy stuff. He was a learned student of music with degrees in music, loved classical music, and was playing bebop and things like that, but was adding harmonically to it. And I didn't know this until recently, but he started off playing saxophone along with piano, which is quite interesting. And I believe it was one of his students that he was good enough on piano to actually get students. And I believe one of his students was none other than Lee Konitz. And there was a whole bunch of people that are associated with Lenny Tristano that worked in his bands that throughout their entire career cited Lenny Tristano as a big influence. And the critics at the time said his music was so advanced. His music is quiet, it's not, when you think free jazz, you think this crazy, wild stuff. But he was more like the John Lewis of modern jazz quartets in terms of he played quietly, almost like a Bill Evans almost at times, maybe not that ballady, but he was adding to the vocabulary of jazz. And some people, even critics, mentioned that they didn't think that his music would be very popular because it was too sophisticated, too far ahead of its time, too harmonically advanced, which is pretty incredible because you listen to a lot of bebop music, a lot of things that fall into the mainstream jazz category, and sometimes it's actually hard to follow because it's so sophisticated. But his students and the people that went through his bands through the years constantly through their entire career cited him as an influence, and they kind of took Lenny Tristano's harmonic innovations and his concepts and continued them even decades after they had left playing with Tristano. And actually, I would have heard, because I read a lot of jazz stuff, I hadn't heard of Lenny Tristano until I picked up an album by, or several albums, by saxophonist Warren Marsh. And I was reading about saxophonist Warren Marsh's history, whatever I could get at the time. This is before the internet. And Lenny Tristano's name kept coming up, and then I found out, tons of people played with him, including Lee Konitz and people like that. And people that, throughout their career, kind of followed in the footsteps of the harmonic concepts and ideas that Lenny Tristano came up with. So it's the only Lenny Tristano I have. This was on Electra Musician label. Great label, all gone, all out of print now. I wish somebody, to the best of my knowledge, nobody's picked these up to reissue. This was just a Lenny Tristano improvisations done in the studio, but with a bassist and drummer. And it was recorded in the 1955-1956 time period in his music studio that he had in New York. And this album was released by Electra Musician, which is run by Bruce Lundvall, who was a very big music executive for many years in many major record companies. But apparently Bruce Lundvall's first love was always jazz, and he had started this label, which didn't last too long, but the albums that they issued were some archive stuff like this, things that were recorded many years before but hadn't been released, as well as current things that were going on. I remember Material, which I think is Bill Laswell's group. The first thing that I ever saw by them, it could be the first album ever came out with, was actually an Electra Musician album. Great label. 1983 this came out in. Label only lasted a couple years. I don't know what happened to all those recordings, but I think they're pretty much all gone now. Did not see the CD era, to the best of my knowledge. I think they were gone by the time CDs came about. I showed Lenny Tristano only because I'm showing Warren Marsh, because Lenny Tristano unfortunately had passed away before I got into any of his music at all. I don't know what made me pick up a Warren Marsh album. And I had mentioned Stan Getz and showed Stan Getz only because of more people would be familiar with Stan Getz, I think, in his playing style, that soft thing where you hear the breath on the saxophone. And I picked them out because this other guy, Warren Marsh, has a very similar style, even softer, even possibly mellower than Stan Getz. And I remember going to New York City, someplace I never go into, and at the time, before the internet, there's a few record shops there, including one called J&R Music, which was really good, where you could get imports and things like that. And I don't think I'd heard of Warren Marsh, and I was, I had bought some fusion jazz there, and I had bought some ECM imports there, and I wanted to also grab something that I thought was a little bit more on the mainstream. And I just randomly picked this up, which was a new release at the time. And again, this is an album that is definitely more mainstream. Who's on it? Roy Haynes, the drummer, Sam Jones, the bass player, Sal Mosca, the pianist from New York. Sal Mosca is another guy not very well known, and Warren Marsh on tenor sax. The thing that interested me in it is, and unfortunately, it's a very short album. It's about 30 minutes long. It's only come out on CD in Japan, and it's ridiculously expensive. It might even be out of print. But I want to get, this is my favorite thing that I ever heard Warren Marsh do. I'm no Warren Marsh expert. I don't have a lot of stuff. But the thing that I liked about this is one side is a standard quartet. And it was all previously unreleased stuff also at the time. From 77 and 79. So for whatever reason, these things were kind of in the can and hadn't been released. Though when they did get released, I don't see the date on here. I want to say it's the early 80s. It was a new release. So they only went unreleased for a few years. 82. 1982 this came out. So that's when I would have bought it. Side 1 is a standard quartet of upright acoustic bass, drums, piano, and Warren Marsh on saxophone. The interesting thing about it is all of the tracks are original, either written by the pianist Saul Mosca or Warren Marsh himself. And the second side, which I like this concept, is just piano and saxophone. And that was, one side was recorded in 77, the other one was 79. And one track, again, there's only 2 tracks on side 2. Something called Background Music is a Warren Marsh original, and they do one standard. And that's it. Only one standard in the whole album. But I like that concept. Nice piano, saxophone on one side, and then the other side is the quartet with bass and drums, piano and saxophone. And I just bought it. I don't think I even ever heard of Warren Marsh. Something piqued my interest. And it wasn't on sale, but it was only $5.99 anyway. That goes to show you how long ago I bought it. I bought it probably when it came out. It might have even been a new release, or maybe I liked the cover. I definitely wanted to get something closer to the mainstream thing. And I like when mainstream musicians, because so many of them don't do any of their own material. I love this album to this day. And I wish I could get that Japanese import, but on CD, but let me tell you, it's a ridiculous price. It's only 30 minutes of music, and oddly enough, one of the CDs I have actually has a couple of the tracks from this album on it, but not the others. So I already have kind of part of the album on CD. But again, Warren Marsh, if you like Stan Getz, maybe he's even more laid back than Stan Getz, but he writes a hell of a lot more than Stan Getz, who really didn't write any that I know of music. Maybe he did, but not much. Just something about his sound that I liked. And it was quiet. There's no honking. There's no screeching. Saxophones can get very annoying to me very quick. So as a result, I started buying Warren Marsh stuff. And here's a nice pairing. You probably know Lee Konitz, and you know Lee Konitz is also not one of those guys that does the screechy saxophone stuff. So if you don't know Warren Marsh, but you know Lee Konitz, Warren Marsh very much fits into that Lee Konitz vibe. So here's a nice album from 1975 with Lee Konitz on alto sax, Warren Marsh on tenor sax, a guitarist, Dave Cliff, Peter Ind, I-N-D, on bass, and Alan Levitt on drums. So that's a nice little band. No piano. 2 saxophone players, a guitar, bass, and drums, live in the club. Here's another one. It's on my wish list to get the CDs, assuming that they're available and in print. Who knows? I don't know. Is Storyville around anymore, the label? Don't know about that. But this date was 1975. It looks like it took a couple years to come out. This has 2 dates on it, 1977, 1981. So this edition came out in 1981. I don't know if that means that the music was held back that long. And here's another live album, once again, from Lee Konitz and Warren Marsh, recorded at Ronnie Scott's very famous jazz club in London. This is from one date. This is May 24th, 1976. I bought that prior album and I liked it. I liked it, and I am not a huge saxophone fan, but none of these guys get screechy and kind of go way out. This time, it's interesting because it's only a quartet with Peter Ind once again on bass, Al Levitt on drums, and the 2 saxophone players, Lee Konitz and Warren Marsh. There's no guitar. There's no piano. So it's only the 4, which is a very interesting thing to hear. Obviously, you've got no harmonic instrument in there. There's a lot of space in there. And none of these guys are blowing their brains out, making a lot of noise. Another thing I highly recommend if you like mainstream jazz at all, and a bit more of the quiet stuff, and if some of these saxophone players blowing their brains out gives you a headache like it does to me, and a couple more recent acquisitions for me is what's playing in the background to whatever extent you can hear it. Warren Marsh Quartet, Berlin, 1980. This was another album that I don't think came out at time. There's some bonus tracks on here from April '77, and I believe, and this is weird, 2 of the tracks on that great album that I showed you, the first one I showed you, from the quartet side are on here, but they didn't include the other 2 tracks. There's 4 tracks on that How Deep, How High album. And they're short. I don't know why they would stick 2, and they have space on here. 2 of the quartet tracks when there's 4 on the other album. And those are all previously unreleased stuff, and not the other 2, so 2 of them are missing. From this album. So I have two of the 4 tracks on side 1, and all of the tracks are only between 4 and 5 minutes long. Why they couldn't stick on the other bonus tracks, the other 2 tracks, at least from side 1, I don't know. Even though those were recorded at a different point. Those were from 70 to 79. And the primary album on here, well, I see it's 78 minutes. That's why they couldn't fit any more. But the primary, most of the material from the album is from a 1980 date by a quartet. Which is Sal Mosca again on piano, Eddie Gomez on bass. Everybody knows him, yes. Kenny Clark on drums, the great Kenny Clark on drums, which had moved. Kenny Clark was the original drummer for the Modern Jazz Quartet. Left the Modern Jazz Quartet to move to Europe because employment was better there and treatment of black musicians was better there. So Kenny Clark was one of those guys that when the American guys came to Europe, he played with them, but he didn't come back to the U.S. to play with them. So I like this. This is obviously fairly late in Warren Marsh's career. I did see somebody give a slightly negative review to the playing on this. I think on Amazon, and I don't hear it. I hear him playing fine, if not even a bit more aggressive than I'm used to hearing him. Not quite as quiet as I'm used to hearing him. Doesn't get screechy at all. But the stuff on here is a bit more up-tempo than a lot of this. Actually, all the previous albums that I showed, the albums with Lee Konitz and the prior album, How Deep, How High. This has more blowing soloing on it, up-tempo, so I don't get somebody giving it a bad review. And here's another of my CDs of his. This is probably my favorite, only because when I hear Warren Marsh, I think ballads, and I think the mellower stuff. And this is, I thought initially when I ordered it that it was a compilation album. And, I feel so about a lot of compilation albums. But actually, I was surprised. It's a 65-minute album that was recorded in one day. It's not pulling ballads off of different albums from all over the place. Recorded April 7th, 1983, fairly late into his career, all on one day. A ballad album, bass, drums, piano, and tenor sax. I was tempted I was going to put this one on in the background, but I thought you might not hear any of it at all if I did. So instead, I've stuck this one on in the back, which has been what's playing for the entire length of the video. Warren Marsh is a guy that if you want to hear a little bit more laid-back saxophonist, and especially if you're a Lee Konitz fan, those live albums that he recorded, there may be more than those 2 that I showed with Lee Konitz. I got to get those on CD. Those are really nice, and I'm not a fan necessarily of hearing more than one saxophone player in a band. But sometimes you just get something that just works, And they were a good pairing, especially in a smaller band. Like I said, they played Lee Konitz and Warren Marsh together in a quartet with only bass and drums, in a quintet with a guitarist, which leaves a lot of acoustical space to hear everything that's going on. So those albums, if you're looking for more mainstream stuff, I have to highly recommend. Now, I guess that album that I bought of Warren Marsh, I think that came out 82? Yeah, 82. So I got into him in 82. Now, I didn't find out until a couple years ago that, once again, Warren Marsh has passed on. He died December 18th, 1987. And it's particularly sad because he actually died. I think may have mentioned this in another video. He actually died playing. He died on stage. He had a heart attack on stage while he was playing a concert. That's really the jazz life, boys and girls. He was playing a concert and just slumped over and passed away. He was playing a song called Out of Nowhere in a Los Angeles club, right on stage. Very, very sad. And definitely kind of the stuff that movies are made of. But of course, he was only 60. Wow. This is scary because all these people I keep on doing reviews of, Chico Hamilton was 92. He was pretty old. But 60? I can't believe Warren Marsh was only 60 when he passed away. And a lot of these guys, Paul Desmond and these guys I'm looking at, are dying, and they're fairly close in age to where I am. Cal Tjader. Was it Cal Tjader? Cal Tjader was another one. He died like the same age I am now. Don't like that concept. Don't like that idea. Anyway, 50. This is way longer than I thought I would go. I was going to do an update on myself and some music I'm working on, but I'm going to save that for another video. Maybe I'll do just a separate, real short 5 or 10 minute video, because this is longer than it really should be. Whatever, I hope some of this was valuable to you. Consider this number 2 in my jazz musicians that I'm bummed out category, because all involving guys I was into when they were still alive, and when they passed away, it's a little hard for me to listen to their music. Warren Marsh has been playing in the background the whole time. Hopefully you got to hear some of it, and hopefully you've liked some of it. And I'll be back with an update about some stuff I'm working on for my next project, whenever that will see the light of day. Okay, guys, hope everyone's doing well. Sorry for going on so long once again, and I'll be back all too soon. Take care.